webinar. The webinar is titled Successful Disaster Recovery Using the Community Capitals Framework. And the presenters are Gary Goreham from the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at North Dakota State University, Ashley Mueller, Extension Educator and Disaster Education Coordinator at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, Kurt Mantonya, Senior Associate with Heartland Center for Leadership Development, again in Lincoln, Nebraska, Duane Gill, Regents Professor of Sociology and Director of the Center of Study of Disasters and Extreme Events at Oklahoma State University. We have a few more. Deborah Bathke, Research Associate Professor, Drought Mitigation Center at University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Nicole Wall, also with the Outreach and Research, she's an Outreach and Research Specialist with the Drought Mitigation Center at University of Nebraska-Lincoln. And then Theresa Jedd, Post-doctoral Researcher at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln as well. So we have a whole crew here who are going to be talking about this. And let me just quickly introduce the topic by reading a few sentences here. No community is immune from natural disasters, but the steps they take during the recovery phase can impact their degree of resilience for subsequent events. The Community Capitals Framework was used by a 5-state multidisciplinary team to examine the experiences of 3 communities: flood recovery in Breckenridge, Minnesota, tornado recovery in Pilger, Nebraska, and drought recovery in McCook, Nebraska. And so with that introduction, I'm going to pass it on to the presenters. And again, thanks to all for being here, and really looking forward to it.
Thank you, Mark. This is Gary Goreham at North Dakota State University, and I will be introducing the topic along with Ashley Mueller, who is at the University of Nebraska Extension. So we want, first of all, to say thank you to the various participants who are from these 3 communities. They were very, very helpful in providing guidance for us as we explored their communities and learned more about the disaster recovery in their various communities. Also, thank you for funding from the North Central Regional Center for Rural Development. The assistance was greatly appreciated. The project began when we had a Community Capital Framework Institute and a Heartland Center conference in Lincoln, Nebraska a couple of years ago. And out of that came some conversation with myself and also Deb Bathke at the University of Nebraska Drought Mitigation Center. Others who were involved with that were Nicole Wall and several others. We then decided that we really needed to know more about how communities work through disasters, and we were particularly looking at the use of the Community Capitals Framework. We do have a sidebar questionnaire for you, if you could mention about how familiar you are with the Community Capitals Framework. If you're not familiar, then we can certainly visit more about that. Also, what kind of disasters you may have experienced. So please feel free to comment on that, and we look forward to hearing more about who you are as well. The players then who are participating in the project included Meredith Redland at South Dakota State, Kurt Mantonya at the Heartland Center, Bimal Paul at Kansas State University. We had a multidisciplinary team. He was a geographer. We had sociologists. Duane Gill at Oklahoma State University was also a sociologist. At NDSU would have been myself, along with Dan Cleno, who is an emergency manager, Becky Koch, and she is with Extension, and Callie Knorr, one of our graduate students. Already mentioned Deb Bathke as a co-PI, a colleague. Theresa Jedd, working in the center. Ashley, whom you'll hear in a moment. Nicole Wall, also to hear. And then a couple of their students, Jacob Peter and Anthony Pusia. So I'll turn it next over to Ashley.
Great, thank you, Gary. So just to open, we are very excited to share a tangible evidence of our project through this extension publication, which is available on the link that you see on the slide. We are very excited to work on this. Becky Koch and I co-led the development of this, and what we think is so special about this is that it is a very useful how-to resource for community leaders and those working with the communities to help their communities recover. So it walks through the process to inventory those assets, everything from organizing a leadership team all the way down to prioritizing those assets. Then looking through on how to leverage those, so developing those goals that are so important, and then coming up with the plan to then lean in on those goals. So we're quite excited about it, and it is available for you to access.
Thanks, Ashley. The methods that we use to visit these three communities, I should back up. Where are those communities? These were the three communities we studied. This would have been Breckenridge, Minnesota, affected by a flood, Pilger, Nebraska, affected by a tornado, and out in McCook, Nebraska, they had the drought. So to do the methods, we actually spent some time in these communities. We actually participated in many of the meetings that they had. We conducted interviews, wide variety of focus groups with many of the residents. We went through their historical archives and newspapers, took piles of photographs, used census data, documents, maps, and ultimately analyzed those data. So what we'll show next are what those results look like. And here's Ashley to tell about Breckenridge.
So Breckenridge, Minnesota is a place where I had the opportunity to really get to know well, because I was able to experience that with Gary and Becky and Callie. And this is a community in Minnesota on the river. And as of the most recent population, it is a little over 3,200 people. And what is a unique characteristic of Breckenridge is that it sits right on the river, but the river, the Red River, flows backward. And so the significant event that we were specifically studying was the 1997 flood, which was very unique in that it was very rapid and severe, and there was long-lasting impacts of that. But it's also to be noted that this community experiences flooding regularly. Since the 1997 flood, they have experienced major flooding 10 times since. So it was very unique to get to see that community, but also to explore Wahpeton just across the river and understand how kind of the twin cities or the twin towns characteristic played into our study there. All right, I'll move forward here. Okay, so the asset map that we were able to put together of Breckenridge, I think, was really interesting as well. I'm not going to go through all of the capitals, but some highlights that I wanted to point out that I thought were really unique to that specific community. The cultural capital, it became very evident early on that the river culture was certainly a part of Breckenridge. Folks tended to embrace the idea of being part of the river and that their story was intertwined with all of these major flooding events. There's a lot of history there. I think, too, in natural capital, what really stood out to me was that the fact that these communities have a zoo. So not a very large community, but one that certainly, it took pride in the fact that they had some recreation opportunities for those folks that live locally, and were able to bring in some other people as well. Of course, I mentioned about the Twin Cities characteristics. So in looking at the financial capital piece, being the Twin Cities with Wahpeton, there was a lot of sister elements there, sharing some resources like a joint chamber of commerce, those sorts of things. And then too, I think the human capital piece was also very, very interesting as well. And we'll talk about that further in the Ripple map, but just some of the leadership opportunities that were there prior to the flood, and how that community really leveraged the leadership in place during that recovery process. All right, Gary, back to you.
All right. Someone had mentioned here that they were less familiar with community capitals, and as Ashley has talked about, each one of these are collections of assets. in the community, and so our job was to do a bit of an inventory of those. So that's what Ashley has described. And in fact, with the 97 flood, various of these capitals were affected. So when it came to the recovery process itself, what we're going to do is a ripple map, and if you can imagine throwing a stone into a pond and it begins to ripple out in various levels, that's what you'll see. So we'll look at an initial reaction and then some of the intermediate reactions and then further out what happened. So one of the assets that we'll notice would be with some of their people, and these are human capital, the people, for instance, the mayor and various services that emerged, and the results were their connections to other groups that came along the way. Additionally, we saw that these officials had good relationships with some of the legislators, which really is an issue of political capital, and that led to a variety of state aid and then some of the different kinds of infrastructure that emerged out of that. For instance, there were levees and flood walls, improvements to roads, and you can see photographs of what some of these look like along the way. We also noted that when it came to social capital, the newspaper played a very substantial role along the way. They were instrumental in developing collaborative relationships with the sister city and mutual aid along the way as well. Ashley.
So in terms of, I mentioned the local leadership there, and after this flooding incident, we saw the emergence of these local leaders, so people really stepping up to the plate and providing leadership in a really difficult time. And so I thought was really interesting then is that we saw an increase in social capital. So there were very active service organizations really working together on completing these projects, recruiting and maintaining a volunteer base. So there was a lot of contributions there. But then over time, and actually there was a decline then in service organization membership, partly due to the demographic of the community, and also too there were folks in that community that were experiencing burnout as a result of being intimately involved in this recovery process for quite a while. So, so I thought that was really interesting too, in getting a chance to do our interviews face to face and really learning more from these community members about their perceptions of that. Back to you, Gary.
Additionally, we saw that natural capital was affected, and part of the recovery process was to work on the parks, rivers. Parks were expanded, and a good deal of aesthetics emerged. They do have a zoo in the area and landscaping long term. When it comes to some of the cultural capital, Ashley had mentioned that they do have a river culture, and that does mean that they certainly keep an eye on the Red River as that broadens in heavy rains. But we saw also a transition that emerged from that, a culture of helping neighbors to investing in community. There were other attempts, for instance, when it comes to culture, the art programs. When it comes to the social capital that Ashley had mentioned, certainly the schools, churches, professions, many of these, the schools were damaged by the flood, and so they took up temporary relocation in churches. And in some cases, when it comes to built capital, some of the older structures were demolished. So they end up having a new hospital, nursing home, courthouses, public schools, and so on. Additionally, there were businesses when it comes to financial capital. Some stayed, some moved out. The Breckenridge Port Authority was instrumental in helping with the changes along the way. So ultimately what we can do is observe that there were the initial triggers, and heavily influenced by the people level capitals, human, political, social. As it emerged, the work that they did ended up enhancing built and financial capital, much of this in a spiraling up notion. And then when it comes to long term, there's where certainly we do see the role of built capital as an effect, whereas the human, political, social were the ones that really gave impetus. One that we noticed was in that immediate recovery, the huge role of social capital. So that is Breckenridge, and the next case study we would like to share will be Kurt Mantonya talking about Pilger.
Good afternoon, everybody. As mentioned, my name is Kurt Mantonya. I'm with the Heartland Center for Leadership Development in Lincoln, Nebraska. I was delighted to be a part of this team along with my colleague Nicole Wall here in the office. In June of 2014, twin tornadoes went through a portion of northeastern Nebraska that included the community of Pilger in Stanton County. And these tornadoes, one of them actually went through Pilger, the other went off to the side. Just really decimated this community took out about 3/4 of the community. At the time, the population is about 352, and then immediately after, there was only about 120 people left. Several folks moved, their houses destroyed, moved to Omaha, to Norfolk, to Lincoln, places like that. And it was the goal of the community to kind of reinvent itself and to bring these residents back and also capture new residents. And I'm going to talk about the process of that as well as how to fit in with the capitals. If you can click on the Omaha World Herald damage map at some point, it'll take you to a site that shows all the destruction. And this is a very ag-dependent community, and one of the pictures you'll see is the grain bins and a bunch of grain that's on the ground. The picture here in the bottom right is the remnants of what was left of one of the schools in the school district for Stanton County. So what I attempted to do was to visit with folks about the community of Pilger in each one of the capitals, previous or what the capitals were like previous to the tornado episode, and then to visit with folks, the same folks, using a sheet that addressed kind of a post tornado to kind of get a sense of, what are these important, what capital could be the most important, or all these capitals dependent on each other. It was a way to for us to test kind of resiliency and also how strong capitals are over time. So just to kind of give you a rundown, for social capital, there were volunteer hours that were over $2 million. If you take a volunteer hour, it's worth something in the neighborhood of $19.34. And there were hundreds of volunteers that showed up immediately after the tornado event to help both for recovery and for the whole Reinvent Pilger process. We also found that immediately after a traumatic event like this, that what is called bonding social capital goes up really high. Also, the convenience store is now complete, and so is a community center. That's the last bullet point there. And these are places for people to gather. They are places to build social capital. And if you'll notice on the bottom right, that photograph there, that's Bret Michaels, the front man from the 90s hair band Poison, who was in the area on tour after the episode, and actually him and his band came in and spent some time to help with recovery efforts. And there he is holding the sign, 378 at that time. After about September of 2014, we got a call from some leaders in Pilger. They wanted to reinvent their community. As I mentioned earlier, they wanted to bring folks back in. So we partnered with the University of Nebraska Rural Futures Institute, other people at the University of Nebraska Extension, the Drought Mitigation Center, folks like that, and other partners. And we actually went in and did a series of town hall meetings to kind of help people come up with task forces to help them identify ways to recruit people, to get new houses built, to build facilities, et cetera, et cetera. And it was an appreciative inquiry process that we use and that we've developed here at the Heartland Center, where we have these town hall meetings. We talk about past successes, what are the lessons of those, and throughout the whole process, we kind of tease out these different task forces that just come up naturally. And these included a community center, which we put under natural and built capital, a school, both built and cultural capital, sustainability and trees. Pilger has a long time Tree City USA moniker, and they wanted to keep that. Bar, restaurant, coffee shop came out of these series of meetings. Recreation, communications. You can imagine post tornado, all the communication systems were down. Cell phones weren't working. The only way to get any messages out, there was a voice recording in at the library, and then there was a bulletin board that hung outside the village clerk's office. Community cleanup, both built and social. There was a huge debris ground that was just to the west of the community where all of this rubble and post-disaster debris ended up at. And then finally, as I mentioned previously, there was a people attraction branding effort that came about. Human capital, 212 people is kind of what's in the area right now. With the Reinvent Pilger program, we helped create those task forces, and I went over those. Another human capital signature was there's a lot of outside help. The Nebraska Environmental Management Association and FEMA was on hand for quite a while. The Heartland Center, Ferguson Development, as I mentioned, University of Nebraska departments. There were a lot of clergy. There were two churches, and they had a lot of behind the scenes roles, helping to get people, helping us identify places to meet. There were new resources and more people willing to help, not only in the immediately disaster response, but in the long-term recovery and the Reinvent Pilger process. Young people became involved. One of the town hall meetings, previous to the meeting that evening, one of our colleagues met with a bunch of the youth and asked them for their perceptions of the community in 20 years. And they actually built dioramas out of this, and then they showcased those that night. And the adults were just going around in this town hall just in awe. Hey, these kids, we've had a loss here, but these kids want to rebuild this community, and this is what they want it to look like. There was a book that was published by Lorraine Top, and then finally, statewide collaboration. The Nebraska chapter of the American Planning Association, working with University of Nebraska-Lincoln, is doing an update to the comprehensive plan, and they're doing this totally pro bono. Political capital, this created new opportunities for leadership. The Reinvent Pilger process helped with creating a sense of a shared vision. So we had these 8 task forces, and everybody was on one of these task forces. Give you an example, the school district, the high school and the elementary school is in the nearby community of Wisner. The middle school was damaged in Pilger beyond repair. So there was a strong sense to rebuild the school in Pilger, but the school board ultimately decided to just consolidate everybody in one location in the community of Wisner. People were upset in Pilger for a short period of time. They realized, hey, this is probably the best thing that we can do. Let's roll up our sleeves. Let's work on something else. And one of those things became an educational component in the community center that was constructed. Once again, there was that comprehensive plan conducted by the APA. One village board person had moved as a result of the tornado, so they had to replace that person on the village board. Built capital, there was a loss of 73 homes, and then I also mentioned that debris pile, but the loss of 73 homes, 19 new constructions have taken place, and those houses have a higher tax value than the older homes that were lost. So they're able to recoup as far as tax dollars with these 19 newer homes. As more and more are being built, more money is being dumped into the village coffers. The new bank is completed. There's a village office that's done and a convenience store that's completed. The co-op is up. As I mentioned, this is an ag-dependent community. Right after this tornado that happens in June, something had to be in place to take the fall grain. You had corn and beans coming in, and they were one of the first ones, along with Midwest Bank, to say, we will rebuild. And they were able to hold that fall grain by the time harvest happened. The library, it remained intact. Pilger is real close to the neighboring Loop River, so you can't have basements because you're close to the water table. So safe rooms, there were grants for several safe rooms, and those were added to the new construction. Several new businesses were and still are being constructed and added on to. I'd already addressed the loss of the school, and the community center is complete. It's also a place for a senior center. It's a place for social capital to happen. There's educational programming going on in there, and they're going to be supporting entrepreneurship by way of helping startups. And then in the top right this is a brand new sign that was installed about 6 months ago. This is a result of the rebranding task force. This is something that they wanted, one of these nice signs instead of that Pilger 372, that green sign that we always see in rural communities. They wanted something to showcase their community, and that's the sign that was installed. Natural capital, over 275 trees have been planted from all the 300 that have been damaged. The parks did survive. The pool, there is a community pool right after the event. It was able to stay open due to some corporate donations. The playground and basketball court were gone. They were adjacent to the school, but there are plans to get something similar in the works. At some of the meetings, we had some entrepreneurs talking about tanking and kayaking are really big in Nebraska, and these folks were trying to come up with ideas to, capitalize on the neighboring Loop River and get people to take advantage of that. The RV park is in the village. Several people were staying in campers, and they added 4 more hookups to accommodate those people who were staying after the tornado. So that's a natural capital bonus. And then, as I mentioned, Elkhorn River, not the Loop, my apologies. Cultural capital, St. John's Church was rebuilt. There was a grand opening on the 2-year anniversary of the storm on June 18th, and that's the flyer there on the bottom right. And then this is a date, I apologize, the community center just got completed. But they already had dates booked for reunions, for alumni events. A lot of grand openings going on, and then more talk about community-wide events such as Pilger Days. Financial capital, Midwest Bank, one of the first ones, as I mentioned earlier, they would rebuild, and it was completed in June of 2016. Some of the businesses that we've seen rebuilt or expanded include a trucking business, tire and towing business, and a farm supply co-op, as I had already talked about, and then donations. Financial capital was just pouring into this community. $25,000 to keep the pool open. We helped here at the Heartland Center write a federal home loan jobs grant for the community, $65,000 from the Corn Board. And this is just touching the surface of all the grants and loans that came into the community. And finally, $300,000 to help fund the community center. And that's it for Pilger. So thank you very much, everybody. If you have some questions, put them in the chat box, and I'll help address those at the end of the webinar.
Okay, so my name is Theresa Jedd. I'm at the University of Nebraska, and I'll present the results of the McCook case study on drought recovery. This was a team project, and it's the result of a lot of hard work on the behalf of everyone. In the last slide, I'll include my contact information as well as the PI, Dr. Deborah Bathke, in case you'd like to follow up with any questions. So we conducted this study in order to build knowledge on the effects that a drought can have. And we've compiled some evidence of drought impacts and an in-depth case study of this rural town. Pictured here, you can see their water tower, which the community is quite proud of. So why do we study drought? Here at the National Drought Mitigation Center, we recognize that drought is a serious hazard. Comparing the magnitude of economic losses resulting from natural hazards, we can see that drought really is a significant threat. Though it's a frequently occurring disaster with adjusted losses that are really only exceeded by tropical cyclones here, pictured fifth down. Drought is often understudied from a disaster management perspective, and we have a couple of reasons why that might be. First of all, the onset and end of a drought can be difficult to determine, and drought means different things to different people. And additionally, the responsibilities for managing and protecting water resources really truly do cross political boundaries, and they're divided amongst many levels of government. So it can be a tricky hazard to study. So why did we choose 2012? Well, 2012 was an exceptionally dry year for the central Great Plains of the United States. There was record-breaking heat and relentless dryness that ended up sparking the third most disastrous wildfire season, with more than 9 million acres burned. And the 2012 drought was one of the most extensive droughts to affect the United States, actually since the Dust Bowl of the 1930s. At its peak, it affected more than 2/3 of the continental U.S., and more than 80% of the productive agricultural land experienced drought conditions that resulted in harvest failures. So as a result, the USDA declared more than 1,000 counties in 26 states as natural disaster areas. So clearly we had our choice of communities that we could select for this study. But in the figures above, you can see that the spread of exceptional drought conditions, which are D4, and they're shown in this darkest color of maroon here in the category labels off to the right in the map above. In July of 2012, the warmest July recorded really drew people's attention back to the devastating effects of drought that had occurred in the early 2000s. And we selected a community here. I will try clicking here. In the southwest part of Nebraska, McCook. And you can see that drought conditions really began in this part of the state and persisted in this part of the state. So McCook's natural features really did predispose it to both be resilient to, but also vulnerable to this drought. And we know that the natural features in McCook really do create economic opportunities for agricultural production. There are businesses and also tourism operators. Lake McConaughey, which is known as the Riviera of the Plains, is located just north of this town. And when you have an extended drought, it really challenges that resilience by reducing lake and pond levels, and it has rippling effects on overall surface water supply, and in turn causes an increased reliance on groundwater for irrigation. So in that summer, conditions in McCook were so severe that actually at the municipal airport weather station, temperatures reached 115 degrees by the end of June. McCook, as are many other rural communities, is particularly at risk to drought, and we've written up a little bit of this based on the literature on rural community development, and we came upon a couple of factors. So there's limited economic diversity. So a lot of the financially lucrative activities in small communities really do center on natural capital. So when you have a drop in water resources, it really can have profound effects on the economy. And furthermore, there's a limited demographic base. So you have an aging population. If you look at U.S. Census Bureau statistics, you can see that rural communities are aging faster than urban city centers. And so this can have negative consequences for the labor workforce. Now, on the other hand, we know that rural communities do have a wealth of social capital and really tightly connected family networks and local experts. Additionally, schools are really hotspots for developing future leaders, and communities pride themselves on providing K-12 education. So there's a lot to be said for the resilience of rural communities. In terms of McCook's specific capitals, we noted that this community of about 7,500, I think the exact number was 7,526 residents at the time, is incredibly rich in capitals. So there's an updated city building and there's infrastructure for water supply. The municipal supply director is a proactive leader in the community and works very closely with the mayor, who is also the YMCA director. And you combine that with the fact that there's a really active city council, you have a pretty strong set of leaders here, which we found formed the backbone of the community assets. Additionally, it's an educated population, and there's also a high level of volunteerism in the community. So some sample impacts and responses from our focus groups show that participants noticed the changes early on, and some irrigators had experienced a shortage of surface water supply, and they noted that they had to start relying on groundwater. And high prices and scarce hay led ranchers to either relocate or sell some of their herds at below normal prices. Hotels and outfitters, additionally gear shops, lost revenues because of a decreased number of hunters coming into the area later in the season. Additionally, people commented that recreational visits to lakes were deterred by reduced water levels and increased toxic blue-green algae. So in response, there were a couple of efforts here. And what we noticed is that farmers and ranchers were the ones to take stock of the changes first. One of the producers said, he was walking through his cornfield and he noticed he could hear a crunching sound. And that's not uncommon. Actually, the effects of drought can manifest themselves first on plants. And sometimes in real severe drought conditions, you can see corn leaves curling in the matter of a single day and lose a crop. So what they did is they took note of the soil conditions and they were proactive in moving livestock around. And additionally, the fire chief was quite proactive in working with city council to monitor fire risk. And the fire chief mentioned that he went around to the fireworks stands around the 4th of July himself to announce to customers to be careful. They didn't have to ban campfires or fireworks, but they were prepared to do so if they had to for the fire risk. Additionally, there was a lot of emphasis on youth education, and certain organizations like 4-H and FFA held programs on the impacts of drought. And finally, the health department conducted some mosquito census counts for West Nile virus, which has been linked to drought conditions. So in order to catalog some of the results, we mapped the impacts onto their capital areas, and you can see that some of the impacts are connected to multiple capital areas. So the fact that individual lawns were going brown because they were so dry affected the natural capital, but it also affected the social capital within neighborhoods as they noticed the look changing. Additionally, once some bugs started emerging, including crickets, gnats, and moths, they were finding their way from the environment into people's homes, which affected human health. So we mapped some of the responses then onto the capitals too, and you can see the difference between the plots on the left and the right. So while natural capital was largely affected by the drought, human and social capital formed the bulk of the response. And when you plot these onto a radar graph, you can see this effect is a little bit more pronounced. And so that's basically just showing that these pre-existing community structures and a culture of leadership really contributed to the recovery. And this is also what we found in the interview results as well. Several people mentioned that they were very proud of the fact that the Ben Nelson home was there. This is his childhood home. And the community historian, who also writes for the local newspaper, the Gazette, said that McCook has a really strong reputation of having governors and senators from here. And he says that stems from participatory democracy, and there's a collective wisdom in that. And really, that collective spirit was what helped the community face drought. So I'm just going to quickly provide a couple of summary thoughts on the lessons learned from these cases. So we know that natural hazards occur at divergent timescales. A tornado can happen on the scale of minutes, or hopefully not hours. A flood can occur in hours and days, and then a drought can stretch over weeks, months, and years. And these hazards have different effects on various types of capitals, really. And recently, we've seen in the news media all of the coverage of the fires last fall in California, which destroyed homes and entire neighborhoods, affecting hundreds of families at a time. So we know that there are a variety of disaster types. We also know that the recovery times vary. Sometimes recovery can happen in a single season. In 2016, Florida's Lake Okeechobee experienced a super bloom of toxic blue-green algae. And at one point, it was measured at 33 square miles. And the ecologists in their region think that heavy rains combined with a hot June were factors in this situation. But there were some underlying vulnerabilities related to community development processes, such as pollutants and pesticides that had been flushed into the lake prior to these conditions. So recovery time can vary depending on what conditions you have going into a disaster. So one of the things that we tried to do in this project is tie it back into about resilience, because this is a concept that has been widely used since the 1970s to talk about the ability of any system, whether it's social or ecological, to absorb a shock or a change and still maintain the relationships between their starting conditions. And here you can see a picture of red cedar tree saplings popping up in a field. And these seedlings really fit the part of the definition of resilience that has to do with persistence. But what we're arguing is that resilience is more than just persistence. So we know that at a basic level, the classic definition of resilience says that a community would absorb shocks and maintain functionality. But what we want to argue is that we should update our thinking. So using some of the community capital's findings, we say that resilience really requires a positive transformation following the natural hazard that would allow communities to actually function better than they did in their prior state. And so these cases that we've shown so far show that community resilience really has a strong social dimension. And I've chosen to highlight a couple of key findings from a Folke piece in the mid-2000s. And their group has really been some of the forefront thinkers in thinking about how crisis can actually trigger a transformation. So let's break it down in terms of the disaster recovery. So what we've seen today is that you may have an initial event, and when the damaged infrastructure is rebuilt, a community starts to come back to life. So what we've done in measuring these community recovery processes is to also consider the amount of time that it takes for the community to return to its prior state. And going beyond that, we're looking at how community building efforts after the emergency response actually spur reflection and learning. And so using some of the examples from the cases, we can think about how these communities changed. And as I was listening to Ashley and Gary and Kurt talk about the recovery processes, I was thinking, well, you know, what happened in Breckenridge following the flood was that it became a stronger sister city with Wahpeton. It also experienced a growth in the arts as those big murals were painted on the walls of buildings and galleries popped up. It became known as an art center. Additionally, when Pilger started rebuilding, you see that the Reinvent Pilger campaign, in addition to that annual cleanup, are things that persisted long after the recovery. And so we'd like to just spur some thinking on how hazards can be catalysts and how these recovery programs can transform a community into something new. And this is just a short example of rethinking forestry practices. And so I put a picture here of not the red cedar this time, instead something that we actually want, which is a tree species that actually suffered in the 2012 drought quite a bit. And the Forest Service guidelines are, I think, evidence of some of the prioritization that has to go on in creating guidelines for recovery. And so in setting up watering zones to say, let's water trees first and turf last because we can replant it much easier than we can trees, these types of guidelines help us think about shaping the communities that we ultimately want to have. So I've just included one last slide here, and this is a graphic from the McCook study, but I think it could easily be populated with data from the other cases. And a lot of what we've been talking about is possibly this 8th capital area, which would be institutional capital. And when communities reflect on the assets they have following a hazard, they may actually put some procedures in writing or create ongoing meetings or structures that long outlive the recovery process. And so I would just like to conclude by thanking everyone for taking the time to listen to the cases, especially about drought, and I guess I'll turn it back over to Gary to do the Q&A session.
Thank you very much, Theresa. A lot of great information there. We had a couple of comments or questions I would like to highlight and then pose them to our presenters. One of them dealt with vulnerable populations. And Heather, this is something that you had brought up. Elderly, the people with disabilities, the institutionalized. And let me comment on what happened with Breckenridge. There were, in fact, several elderly people in homes as the flood waters were rising that their neighbors were able to come and evacuate them and help with that. Some did not go, but there was that social capital connection. So in that sense, social capital was leveraged in order to address that concern. But I really like this notion of institutional capital because that even was seen when it came to the government evacuation plans, the requirements of the local nursing home and hospitals to be able to provide that evacuation of the vulnerable population. The challenge came as with the recovery, what assets were available to be leveraged in order to bring people back home and rebuild homes and such. Interestingly, there too was both institutional but social capital, as a local organization was created. Ashley alluded to that. And it was monies that flowed to that from voluntary sources that provided those funds. But Kurt, I would like to turn to you also because, as Theresa mentioned, the speed of the onset is quite different from a flood, a tornado, and a drought. How were vulnerable populations served both during and then after the tornado?
Well, I think that's one of the reasons people left the community so quickly, Gary. They didn't have any places to go. You know, if you had family in the immediate area, folks moved in with them. Otherwise, you left for, you know, as I mentioned, Norfolk, which was about 30 miles away or 20 miles away, Lincoln about 2 hours, or Omaha about 2 hours.
And what about for the drought? Theresa, Deborah, how were vulnerable populations addressed? What capitals were employed?
So first of all, McCook relied heavily on built capital. They had a senior center that they were able to equip with additional air conditioning capacity, and they partnered with a home health agency that was actually a private organization and the public health department to identify vulnerable residents who were in their homes during the day. So these are people that aren't in the workforce, who didn't have air conditioning. And so they could go to this senior center, which became a cooling center. They were very careful not to call it a shelter, because if it were a cooling shelter, it would have required additional rules around it, but it was a center for cooling. And so the fact that they had that community center building and they were able to just reconfigure the space a little bit to bring the elderly in and keep them cool, I think was a big asset. Additionally, they were looking out for school kids who had asthma, and the public health department mentioned that asthma in the school population had been an ongoing concern even in the previous decade. So they were really looking out for the effect of all the dust and additional smoke from nearby fires on these kids who had asthma.
Well, that's helpful to see that on a longer term event like a drought, that there would be capitals employed, and built capital in your case, and certainly what we saw in a very quick activity like the flood or the tornado. Wayne asked a question or made a comment about the notion of digital capital, and I do hear that occasionally from our youth who are very attuned to social media. What media sources, and particularly digital media, might have been evidenced in either the tornado or the drought situation? Kurt, can you respond to that?
Well, I'm trying to think, Gary. Right after the incident, there was no communication at all. You know, digital, as I mentioned, cell phones were out. As things got back online, they did create a Reinvent Pilger Facebook page, and it was a place where people could post information and get information and talk about upcoming events. That's the one case that's coming to mind right now.
How about out in McCook, Theresa?
So for communication with social media, I think it was something that honestly didn't come up that much in this case. I do remember that the fire chief mentioned that updates went out on Facebook about some of the voluntary water use restrictions. So the city utilities director had worked pretty extensively with the mayor in 2004 to design a water conservation plan. And so I believe that there were some Facebook updates about the water conservation status, which would require residents and homeowners to change their lawn watering schedule, maybe water during the night or every other day. I've seen social media used in drought recovery in interesting types of campaigns. You can see that in California, in cases of really extreme drought conditions, that there was, I think, a lawn shaming campaign that happened on Twitter or another platform where people with exceptionally green lawns who were obviously not adhering to water conservation measures then were sort of publicized for it. Now, we didn't hear anything like that in McCook, but I would imagine that had the restrictions become mandatory and or more stringent that it would become pretty clear, you know, when somebody's not abiding by the restrictions for law and order.
And I would have to say, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead, Theresa.
Oh, you know, I think that's about all I had to say about it. I was going to maybe comment a little bit on the demographics of the community and the average age of social media users and then the average age of the residents of the community. I do remember there was a community message board at the Economic Development Corporation. It was actually just a whiteboard where school kids had come in and written things they liked about the community, and that was almost like a central way to communicate without technology.
Well, I think this notion of digital capital really gets in the area of communications. And in the case of Breckenridge, I'll make a comment, and then Ashley, if you have some thoughts from the interviews. The flood took place in 1997, so well before our current involvement with social media. However, great emphasis on communication through the newspaper, through meetings, through radio and television. I would suspect that today, if we were to find the same thing, the role of digital capital would be greatly increased. And I think that would be certainly an area well needed to explore. Ashley, did you have any observations?
This is Mark. I just wanted to find a way to wrap up. We're getting close to an hour, and it's all been really great information, but we also need to be aware of the time element as well. So maybe this could be the last sort of question or a response to the thought, and then we can close off.
Okay, well, thank you very much for allowing us to explore these communities. We recognize that the Community Capitals Framework can be a useful tool when looking at the disaster, the recovery, the response, and we look forward to visiting with others. If any of the people who are participants would like to visit with any of us as presenters, we certainly are available. I think that the contact information is available. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you to all the presenters, and thank you as well to the participants. Really great, useful case studies of thinking about the Community Capitals Framework. It resonates with some of my own research as an economist looking at economics of natural disasters as well. So I really appreciate all the work you've done. And so with that, I just would like to sign off for now and say thanks again to everyone.